Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So, since I'm intending to upload this video probably on Christmas Eve, I'm going to go with a Christmas theme. And I'm not going to do my normal exhaustive video where I go down every nook and cranny to find the entire argument. I'm just going to kind of do something fun. And that fun thing is to talk about George Bailey from It's a Wonderful Life as a traditional science fiction and fantasy hero. Now, when I say traditional science fiction and fantasy hero, I mean he's a traditional hero and a science fiction and fantasy hero. I don't mean he's a traditional science fiction and fantasy hero, if you can see the difference. And very briefly, I just want to say in the background right now, you're looking at some of the art from my new graphic novel, The Valiant Heroes. It is a story about traditional heroes. It is an 82-page superhero comic extravaganza, which concentrates on epic storytelling, excitement, and fun. So if that sounds appealing to you at all, you might want to click on that link in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novel is for you. But that's all I'm going to say about that today. I want to get back to George Bailey. Now, first of all, yes, I understand, and I freely admit that It's a Wonderful Life is only in the public consciousness because people watch it over and over again every Christmas. Now, why do they do that? Well, they do that because this story really didn't do well when it first came out. So much so that they let everything lapse on the licenses. Is it the license or the trademark or something like that? Anyways, point being is that it went into the public domain pretty quickly and no one cared. And when you have a handful of television stations, which you did way back then, 50, 60 years ago, that wanted to have programming around Christmas time, and they know people are traditionally not going to be glued to the television at Christmas, and therefore they're not going to make new shows or show new shows during that time. They just wanted to rerun old things as cheaply as possible. Well, the easiest thing to grab at was It's a Wonderful Life, because it is the cheapest thing imaginable, because it was free, because there was no one that they had to pay in order to show this movie at Christmas time. So they showed it over and over again. So, yes, I understand all of that. But at the same time, I still think it is a wonderful story, a traditional story that follows storytelling almost to a T, and that it is a heroic story at the same time. Now, first of all, why would I say that it's a science fiction and fantasy story? Well, because, as I'm always saying, if you go back to the traditional idea of what a story is, that has existed for several millennia now, I would say going back at least to the 400s BC, if not back to even the Mycenaean period in Greece, which would be closed out around 1000, possibly 1200 BC. You have a story, and it is a rhetorical argument. And the way a story works properly is if that rhetorical argument follows the pattern and rules of argumentation, logical argumentation. And tied up in all of that is that your story is also a reflection of reality, because logic and reason, if used properly, is itself a reflection of reality. And as many people ask me on my channel, how can you say that a science fiction and fantasy story is a reflection of reality? Well, very easily. What you do is you take your argument and you add a contingent proposition to it. Now, let's talk about a contingent proposition just very briefly, as if we're talking about a future event, because that's a contingent proposition. So if I say that it's going to rain in this specific place on the 30th of January 2023, and it's not that date yet, which it isn't, then that's a contingent proposition. I don't know until that moment arrives, if I'm in that place, whether or not it's going to rain there. Now, I can assume that it's either true or not true, but that's the contingency of it. And so, this is the kind of contingent proposition that you add to a good science fiction or sometimes fantasy story. It's, for example, let's say we assume in the future that mankind builds ships so that he can sail to the stars. What would the human experience look like after that? So you're assuming that that contingent proposition is true, and then going on from there to map the human experience according to that contingent proposition, as if it were true. And we're all familiar with those kinds of stories, but we also might be familiar with stories that take a contingent proposition in the past and assume that when it came about, where that contingent proposition was to be resolved, something other than what actually happened happened. For example, we'll go back to the ending of a certain war and say, what happened if the other side won, instead of what traditionally happened in history. That's a contingent proposition applied to a past event rather than a future event, which makes a good story. And this is what we have with George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life. It is a contingent proposition that is applied to the past. What if George Bailey had never been born? What would the world look like? Now, the reason why I say this is a science fiction / fantasy story is because that kind of contingent proposition story is traditionally reserved for science fiction. Why? Because if you take something and change it in a fantasy world like that, it doesn't really matter. It's just part of the fantasy world. It exists in that way. It doesn't have the same impact as if it happens in our universe according to what is traditionally thought of as science fiction. But at the same time, I call it a fantasy story because it's not science which makes the determining factor of what changes this thing in the past for It's a Wonderful Life. No one invents a time machine and goes back and then changes something which causes a butterfly effect, which then has all of these successive events happening because George Bailey wasn't born. So it's not science that causes it. It is, and take this how you wish to take it, it is fantasy. That is to say, it is a fantastical element that goes back and changes that thing. And that fantastical element within It's a Wonderful Life is the power of God and the working of angels. So that's why I would call it a science fiction and fantasy story, because it fits neatly into those two categories at the same time, using elements of both in order to set up its contingent proposition, which is what, well, not what the entire story revolves around, but the entire revolving world which circles around a central point. And it is that central point that makes George Bailey a traditional hero. And that central point of the entire story is a choice of George Bailey. Now, again, as I'm always going on about, in case you're not familiar with my channel, I always talk about heroes, and heroes as paragons of virtue, because, once again, I could go back to Mycenaean times, 1200 BC, and show you heroes that are paragons of virtue. And so, traditionally, in Western civilization, heroes are paragons of virtue, and it is that virtue which makes them into heroes, and it is that virtue which makes George Bailey into a hero. But at the same time, what is a virtue? Well, a virtue, A, is a habit, and B, is a habit that allows you the power, or itself is the power, for you to accomplish your ends. That is, the ends set out for you as a human being. Something like fulfillment, happiness. But I want to concentrate a little bit on the idea of virtues being habits, because this is what is playing out within George Bailey's life. Because habits themselves, what are they? Well, it's a choice. He's making a willful choice, and habits are making that willful choice over and over and over again so that it becomes ingrained in your life, so that if you happen to have a lapse in some kind of concentration or you're weakened in some way, you're going to continue out of habit to make that good choice. Well, we're talking about good choices here. We're talking about virtuous choices. You can have habits which are vices, of course, but at the moment we're talking about habits which are virtues. Virtues because they direct you towards what is right and good and beautiful, and it directs you towards that because it is trying to get you to be fulfilled, and what is just and good and beautiful is what is going to fulfill you, is what is going to fulfill any human being. But again, the point being, a habit is making that choice over and over and over again. But at the same time, let's look at choice itself, that act of the will. What is an act of the will? And by the way, I'm going back all the way to Augustine of Hippo, which might actually play into the Christmas theme of this. I'm not entirely sure. Was Augustine's life overlapping with that of St. Nicholas? It might have been. They could have even indeed attended some of the same councils together. Someone put that in the comments if they know. But the point being is that Augustine of Hippo, he flushed out the idea of will that we still use today, which contrasted the old Roman and Greek ideas of will, which were much more centered around the fact that, no, you don't have complete control over what happens within your life. There are these larger forces that play out and control you and where you go and what decisions you make. But no, Augustine of Hippo said, no, this is all you. Your will is you doing what? Well, it is placing your love upon something. And when you place your love upon something, you will try to grasp that something. You will try to embrace it because that's what joy is. It is embracing the thing that you love, having and enjoying what is loved. And so once you place your love on this thing, you try to move yourself towards it so that you can embrace it. And that movement is your choices. That is the act of the will. That is the process of willing itself. At the same time, I'll have to point out that if you place your love on something which isn't real, something which isn't part of what is just and good and beautiful, then since it is a fantasy, since it is a phantasm, when you go to embrace it, it will not be there, and therefore you will never gain joy from that thing. Therefore, you will be going towards something that will not make you happy, and you will not be fulfilled. Which again is just another way of saying you're not moving towards what is just and good and beautiful, because that is the origin of all that exists. Which again plays into the theme of this entire story of George Bailey, based upon the power of God and the movement of angels. But what does this all have to do with the life and the choices of George Bailey? Well, here's the thing about George. George does have that habit, that virtuous habit, of moving towards what is right and good and just. He does that through the service of others. But as we see within the movie, that original choice, which was made over and over again and became a habit for him, was dependent upon that love given to him and expressed by him that started out and was primarily, to a great extent, influenced by his being a child, by his being a kid. That's when it developed, because he was so embraced with love that, yes, during his childhood, that's when this habit began to form. But here's the thing. Being a child, he doesn't have a fully formed reason. That is to say, not all of his decisions were made entirely by his movement of himself. It was influenced by those around him. But for him, really, it was that loving embrace which moved him straight from being a child into young adulthood, into being a man, without him having to make that choice for himself, depended upon his own reason, depended upon his own fully formed, I accept this thing. It was a constant movement from when he was a child. Yes, it was good. Yes, it was habitual, but at the same time, it was never fully his choice. Or I suppose you could put it another way and say it had an origin point which was not fully his choice. And that's where the trouble lies for George Bailey. Why? Well, because when his life starts to get hard, when those times when habit is actually needed started to appear, cracks started to form in his choices that were made, or in those habits that were the choices that he had set upon himself, because he was following, to some extent, the duty of just doing the same thing over and over again. And that's not a bad thing, but at the same time, that duty, his service to others, which continually grew and grew, the more he served others out of love for them, the more service that was laid upon him, it started to be that he was seeing that duty as an ends in itself, rather than a means to an ends, which is to say, rather than to get to the ends of embracing that thing which he had placed his love on, and again, placing his love upon it because he made that free choice to do so. Since that free choice was a little bit skewed by the fact that it began when he was a child, he started to see the duty of doing these things over and over again, the habit of doing it, of service to others, as being the ends in itself rather than the means to the ends. But habit and duty is no good as an ends in itself. Itself does not bring you to that thing you want to enjoy and love and embrace. And so he begins to feel resentment towards what he is doing, while at the same time feeling love for those and being generated from a place of service of others. When he makes a choice, when he serves others, he knows he's doing right. He knows that this is the right thing to do, but at the same time, he's resentful that he has to serve others rather than doing what he wants to do, rather than getting even a moment for himself to do what is a service to himself, what he has always wanted to do. And so we get to the point where George Bailey has life piled upon him so heavily that he simply decides to abandon his duty to others, his service to others. He justifies it to himself by saying, I'm going to kill myself, and they're going to get the money from this insurance policy, this life insurance policy that I have. And so, yeah, I will still be serving them in death, but that's an excuse. He's looking to do the selfish thing, to have the selfish out and say, I'm doing this purely for myself. This is a choice for me, because I have never gotten to make a choice for me, and this is the only one left open to me that I can make. And that's when Clarence appears. That's when the angel called Clarence appears, and he stops George from making that selfish choice. And then, with the help of George himself, with loose words from George, thinking out loud that it would be better if he was never born, to go backwards in time through the power of the fantastical, through the power of God and angels, and change that point where he was born, so that George Bailey could see what life would look like for everyone else around him, which he was using his life to continually serve, what that life for them would look like if he was not there. And it is in viewing that world where he could not serve others, where he was not there to do so, which at the same time is a world where he still exists, and therefore he could go off and do whatever he wanted to do. He could be as selfish as possible now. Why? Because he has no tether to others. But in viewing that world, it makes that act of the will, that decision that he makes on that bridge, change completely around. And change completely around because he is now making that free will choice of his own. That is not one that is dependent upon when he was a child, even if it was from a good place, not dependent upon all of those habitual things which began so long ago, but he's making that free choice in his here and now, that he will serve others, that he will direct himself towards the service of others, and he will do so joyfully, because he knows, through viewing the world where he did not exist, that this is what will not only make him fulfilled, but will make the world a better place. Or at the very least, the world of those, really all of those around him, a better place. And it is that choice, that one choice, that this entire movie, entire story is based upon. And really, the entire reason why I called George Bailey a traditional hero. Because this is a heroic choice on the part of George Bailey. He not only directs himself towards what is just and good and beautiful, he not only chooses freely to continue in a joyful way to serve others, but he indeed, of a higher power, begs to do so. And that is indeed a heroic choice. All right, I'll leave it there, except to say to everyone, Merry Christmas.